Our independent stamp of approval is assurance that you're getting rigorous standards-based training that will help you develop the skills and knowledge essential to excel in a complex, competitive marketplace. Please note that you have been placed on mute for the duration of this webinar and that you may ask questions during the Q&A session using the Ask Question function in your GoToWebinar dashboard. Just a little bit on our host today, Michelle Luque. Michelle has more than 20 years of experience with Mercuri International, the global leader in customized sales training and consulting. He is therefore well positioned to train companies and individuals to navigate through the profound changes that have occurred in the world of sales since the beginning of the third millennium. As a coach, trainer, and writer, Michelle Luque has worked on 5 continents with some key customers including ABB, ArcelorMittal, Philips, Samsung, SAP, Tata Communications, Total, just to name a few. His expertise spans from sales and sales management, leadership skills, presentation skills to account management, customer and employee satisfaction surveys, as well as the intercultural deal making. Now, without further ado, I'll hand it over to Michelle to start.
Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome wherever you may be in the whole universe. It will be a pleasure to share with you. I have witnessed firsthand the evolution of sales over the last 30 years of my career, and also show you how Mercuri International continues to help companies and individuals like yourself weather the world of sales after 60 years of providing training and consulting in this field. So although we're new with CPSA, we've been doing this around the world for over half a century. In fact, we train some 15,000 companies and about 250,000 individuals each year around the world. Now, actually, I don't know how many people we have on this webinar, maybe 250,000? Not quite, but I'm sure it's getting close, and I wish it will go that way one day. One thing is for sure is the people on this call today are most likely born at very widely different periods. And since this is called the third millennium sales, it would be interesting for all of us to have a quick poll on that, knowing in which period were you born. So I'm going to ask Rupalin to launch this poll. And I will also stop my camera so that you're able to concentrate on the poll. Don't worry, your age will not be held against you. It's really for us to have an understanding of where you stand today.
So we're almost there, Michelle. We have about half of our attendees now voting, so we'll just give it another 30 seconds.
Okay, and I will take this opportunity to put some gear on so that I can better concentrate, and also you can better hear me. And then we have the full bandwidth for this webinar.
Perfect.
Just checking that you can all hear me. Rupalin?
Yep, for sure.
Absolutely.
Okay, so the results are in. We have 50% who are Gen X and 25% who are baby boomers and 25% who are millennials.
Wow, okay. All right. Very good to know. So we span the whole spectrum. This is wonderful to have this as the beginning. Now, let's go right into it and look at the objective for today. The idea here is that we live in a world that's undergoing great transformations. In some cases, new technologies are revamping how entire industries have functioned for centuries. The speed at which these changes are taking place is often breathtaking. As salespeople in the midst of these changes, we are ever under great pressure to close business and bring in revenue. Some of the methods often used seem to no longer apply or yield only meager results. At the same time, we may also be under great pressure to embrace new ways of working. In some way, some of you may be struggling with applying these methods efficiently and effectively as well. In these challenges and struggles, what if we could obtain a clear map highlighting not only new methods, but also more conventional techniques that are still relevant and applicable in the third millennium? Imagine if such methods could help us close business faster and avoid pitfalls in the sales process. Wouldn't it be great if we could be armed with the latest weaponry and the most recent defensive armor to fight and win in the current often cutthroat competitive battlefield? What if we had at our disposal enhanced tools to navigate the treacherous waters of today's markets? Some of you may think, how realistic is it to obtain such maps, weaponry, and tools given the rapidly shifting terrain? Others among you may feel already overwhelmed with the tools currently available and may feel that adding more of them would only confuse them more. My aim today is to take you to a higher level. Not necessarily in this short 1 hour call. The aim is to transform yourself into a future-proof sales professional, but that's not going to happen in 1 hour. What will happen, though, is that I'm going to give you an overview of what it will take for you to get there and have sort of a roadmap of how you can do the following. Essentially, to be able to know what has changed in the world of sales, what has remained pretty much the same, and also how to deal with both. With the audience we have today, we have some people who have, like myself, would have witnessed quite a bit, perhaps, if today you are a baby boomer. The Generation X, like myself, will have also seen quite a bit. And then we've got the millennials that also have something to say in this. So let's look a little bit at what has changed in the world of sales first. And most of all, what has also remained the same. So even the best salesperson in the world is useless if not present on the customer's buying journey. So what I mean by this is that essentially things have changed quite a bit, and some of you would already know about this change, that essentially in the past, it was fairly simple. Customers could be found in certain areas, in trade shows. You could connect with them via the phone, doing some cold calling. You would have a pretty good idea of where they were. And sometimes the biggest problem was for them to find us as salespeople. So to some extent, the power was back then with the salespeople to some extent. We held the information that the buyers were seeking. And it wasn't so easy for them to actually gather this information. Now compare that with today. Any customer today can go online, find out plenty of information, good or bad, right or false, but in any case, plenty of information online. And therefore, the power to some extent has already switched to them. Second, there is no one way of buying, so there is no one way of selling. The one single sales model is dead. Essentially, it means that since now customers could be on any type of platform, they could be on any kind of social media, they have their own preferences. We have to be present where they are. And therefore, there's no longer one way of selling because there's so many different ways of buying from them. And essentially, in order to sell effectively with them, we need to match their preferences, and which means that often we need to be pretty much everywhere. Number three, some sales practices of yesterday no longer work. I mentioned cold calling. These days, although there are still some industries that are going back to this practice, this is most likely having very much diminishing results. And in some cases, it's just not worth anyone's time to be doing something like this. Now, of course, there's also certain things that would have somewhat remained the same. And let's look at those. So actually, we've identified as a company and defined for you, in order to be successful in the market, 32 different practices which are still valid in the traditional sales approach, and then 20 that are critical to modern practices that sales rep must master. So my question to you is, are you prepared to face the third millennium customer? Are you prepared to face customers in the third millennium? To which extent do you master those 20 modern practices? And which ones will be actually critical for your business? Businesses are also different, and we will also look into that. Now, what this means is that it could be that a millennium will have quite some ease at mastering these 20 critical modern practices as compared to someone who is, let's say, is a baby boomer or a generation X like myself. So it's important to understand that, of course, we're not born equal when it comes to that. Baby boomers would have basically computers would have appeared in their lives way after their childhood. For Generation X, in my case, I was one of the first users of personal computers, but I was already in my 20s when that happened, so I was not born with it. Now, millennials often are living with it throughout their lives. They have lived with it, and not only this, today we can even see babies in front of an iPad at 2 years old, 3 years old, and already quite savvy at using those tools. So the world is changing, and therefore there's got to be a bit of both. Having said that, what could be the challenge for millennials is to master those 32 practices that are still valid in the traditional sales approach. And this could definitely be a challenge. Of course, there are different work and business models, and some come up and then get redundant. Some old tasks disappear and new ones appear. Processes change, services and products get transformed. Changes sweep over buying and selling channels. There's more information than ever. So there's all of that is actually changing. Let's look at some statistics to help us navigate those changes. So actually, it's more than 57% today of B2B buying research is done online before contact is ever made with a company, with a seller. That means that the customer you're meeting, most likely, and that's on average, 57% of their buying journey has already been done, most likely online, before they even meet with you. So in other words, oftentimes their whole opinion about your industry, about yourself, about your products and services has already been kind of established. Not only that, 71% of B2B researchers start a generic query online. And actually 89% use the internet during the B2B research process. So it's important to understand that it's not everybody still. There are people, believe it or not, that will not reach directly for Google or whatever search engine online when they have a need for a certain product or service. So it's still important to understand that it depends. There's still some people that are across that great generational divide. Also, and this is very interesting, and this brings back some of our power, 74% of buyers choose the sales rep that was first to add value and insight. This means that if you are positioned as the first person on their buying journey and you're able to add value and insights, then essentially you have a tremendous chance of winning the business. I've been in sales for 30 years. I do not claim to be able to be successful 74% of the time. Having said that, if I am able to be the first one to add value and insight, this is what we're looking at. This is possible. Also, a little bit more on transformation. Customers search information and compare providers through the different buying, selling, and channels. So again, we need to be pretty much everywhere. And then customers decide if they have an interest to buy specifically from you. So of course, their decision sometimes is already done while you are not even aware of it. You're already filtered out sometimes, even before you're aware of a customer and their needs. Customers are expecting insights, knowledge from the seller. This hasn't changed and is still very much what you can provide. When you're the one that provides that knowledge and insights, definitely you have that edge. It's tougher to get in touch with customers. Let's face it, everybody is quite solicited, and customers are getting more and more averse to getting interrupted. They want to be connecting on their own terms. So from our perspective, we need to be able to find what that bridge can be, but it's definitely getting more and more difficult. Also, online and different channels extend the sales tool set. So that is our possibilities to impact and communicate to and with customers in a much wider way. But then this is if we take advantage of such tools. Now, not every industry is going to have the same outlook. So not every industry is affected by new technology the same way. Some have experienced rapid transformations that have completely disrupted how they function, while some have remained relatively oblivious to those changes. Let's look at various industries and estimate their pace of adoption of new technologies. While some of you may rightly question whether this would apply to your specific industry and context, I still invite you to consider the following slide as a starting point. So this is based on research essentially into different industries and what's their digital maturity. Now, today, many of you would recognize that if you want to book a ticket or book a vacation somewhere, if you're having any connection with IT companies or even retail banking, you'll find them that they are very tech savvy. Their digital maturity, generally speaking, is very high. Pretty much everything is automated. There's a lot of AI involved, and some may even think that in some of these industries, salespeople are getting more and more redundant, or they need to be able to add more value. At the other side of the spectrum, if we look at the building industry, recently I have a very nice fellow who takes care of my swimming pool, and essentially I wanted to send him some information. So I said, can I just text you? And he said, no, I don't know how to work text messages. So I had to kind of write it down on a piece of paper. So you see that, and of course, this is just an anecdote. Not everyone is in that situation, but you'll find that generally speaking, in building, agriculture, handicraft, many industries essentially are not yet there. Having said that, again, we cannot generalize, because we could have easily a young person working for them that has totally embraced everything. Having said that, the lesson for you though is if you're selling to the building industry or the agriculture industry, you need to be aware that there's only so much you'll be able to do through your website or through your social media presence, because this is not where those people like to be. So going back to the customers online. So how about our communication? So in 2014, it was surveyed that 57% of the journey was already completed before even a salesperson would show up. By 2017, we estimated it should be about 80%. By 2019, is it going to be higher? Most likely, knowing that it's probably not ever going to be 100%. So what does that mean in terms of how we sell? Now, if we look at a traditional approach, 10% on average was completed before the salesperson would be invited, or would make contact. So it was a fairly simple traditional sales approach. Most of you would be familiar with this in one way or another. You'd use perhaps different names. Terminology are not important here. There's no test on that. But essentially, yes, you would have to establish contact, identify the needs, then develop the right proposal according to those needs, and then hopefully close the sale. So it was a fairly simple and traditional sales approach. These days, this has remained somewhat the same, but there are new steps that we need to be aware of. So now, in the third millennium, the approach is knowing that more than 57% has already been done. The steps that we do when we get into contact with prospects then would still be to have an introduction and connect and guide our contact. There would still be that first contact phase. But then what is critical is to have a proper diagnosis, to be able to assess the sales situation. Where are they in their buying journey? Do they already have a need? And where is that need coming from? Do they have or they have no need? Or are they already actually looking at a number of solutions? Or are they actually ready to make a purchase? All of that will have a very big impact on how we sell to them. And not only this, it will have an impact. If we do our job correctly, we should then look at the third phase of discovery, which still is a traditional step, but here it needs to be much more targeted. Basically, one rule of thumb is, and from experience, these days we really need to be careful about this discovery period. We should never waste our quota of questions, in the sense that we need to make sure that every question we ask in our discovery is something that is not something we can find on the internet. And of course, the idea is still to understand and influence the customer and then transform their needs into opportunities. And step number 4 has not necessarily changed so much. Might be that the tools that we use for it have changed, but it's still about persuading the customer, convincing them that our solution is best for them, and then close the business. So essentially, what it means is that the future of salesmanship in the third millennium is with those who will leverage technology and reinvent their sales processes to meet the expectations of the new digital age customer. So it's actually both. Let's look at what we need to keep and also what we need to perhaps introduce, or perhaps for different people it will be the other way around. But in any case, let's look really in detail what has remained the same. So out of those 32 different practices that are still valid, now, yes, you need structure. You need to be able to put in the efforts. You need to connect with the customer. You still need to know your customer, although what it means, of course, that we need to find out from various sources, including online. Preparation is still key. This hasn't changed. Discover needs is still I would say, the most important step. And in order to do this, to discover implicit needs and the stakes and objectives, it's very much about questioning techniques, perhaps even more than before. My experience as a salesperson is that to be successful and to be accepted and to create a great relationship with customers, there's nothing like having the right questioning techniques. And this is something that as salespeople, yes, it is the basics. You could say, I'd rather talk about the fundamentals. This is the most important thing as a tool that a salesperson needs to have. And therefore, every once in a while, we need to make sure that our questioning techniques are up to par. They should be at the best level possible. Reformulation is still something very much important, to be able to summarize what the customer and do this tactfully, do this artfully. Understanding personalities is still very much there. Steer the call, to be able to gain the power in the call and not be taken where the customer want, which is not necessarily where we would like to be. We need to build credibility. We need to sell the need, sell the solution, sell the value, argue with benefits, prove that those benefits are indeed of advantage to the customers through our characteristics. We need to sell the urgency, and perhaps even more than before. There's so many solicitations from everywhere. Why should the customer do this first? Why should they take your offer first? And anything that helps in that urgency is extremely valuable. This is a key point to actually make you sell faster and close faster. Competitive selling, very much when you think that in the age of the internet, there are potentially in some industries hundreds of competitors. We still need to manage resistance and objections. That hasn't changed. We need to manage complaints sometimes, hopefully not too many. We need to be able to deal with the price objections. We need to be able to definitely have a way to deal with the last three objections, which I'm not going to surprise you here. You probably have heard these before. The customer says something after your presentation, says something like, let me think about it. Now that's one. Or I need Mr. or Miss so-and-so approval for it. Or I need to check with your competitors. So this hasn't changed. And in the age of the internet and digital age, these are still very much there, and perhaps even more than before. We still need to be able to present the price in a confident way, in a way that sells. Negotiation skills, still relevant. Managing the buyer's tactics, to understand how to read them and deal with them. Resist the urge to bargain, to be able to really maintain our best prices. Still somewhat artfully and indirectly weaken the competition and reverse the burden of proof. Let the customer explain. Let the customer deal with their own objections. So, and then closing and loyalty building. These are all tools that have not changed. They are still very much relevant to what we're doing today. Next, there are 20 modern and critical practices. Now, to use the web in order to identify and target prospects, more and more you'd be using perhaps LinkedIn, even Sales Navigator. You'd be using the web, different search engines, different methods to actually identify and target those prospects. We need to master social selling and customer acquisition. For most industries, this is key to be able to acquire new customers. And one way of doing that is to multiply our leads by providing freemium, providing free gifts or something of value to the customer, so that we can both improve the quantity and quality of our leads. Increase the sales efficiency by mastering the engagement funnel. We need to be present throughout the customer's journey, and that means to be able to contact and connect at different times throughout that journey. We need to be able to align precisely that buying and the sales process, and also understand the three different types of need trigger, which is we have some forced, planned, and stimulated. So there's quite a lot of knowledge in this, and it's not within the scope of this webinar to talk about that, but it's important to understand how we can actually have an impact on the customer. Also, how to use the web to prepare a contact, know what to look rapidly, because we don't have tons of times to do this, how to do this very effectively to get to know the person before we even meet them. Connect with the right person through social media. Diagnose the situation through MAP. MAP is a very important model called maturity, autonomy, and preference. Essentially, this is a roadmap that enables you to know where you stand and how to sell effectively with a buyer. Use the new tools and techniques to discover. There are more and more tools available for that, and it's good to know about them. build and master the 3D argumentation. So there are new ways of argumenting, and that also includes storytelling to influence and convince. This also means that we can use different tools to build and use presentations for either one-on-one or one-to-many. That means that we need to have different methods. There are tools today that enable us to, with a small group, to have very, very powerful presentations in as little as 10 or 15 minutes for a very complex sales. So these are tools that have been created and used successfully by some of the largest, usually most advanced IT companies. And as an example, we have trained companies like HPE, SAP around the world on those principles. Also companies like Philips. Master web meeting to present a solution like I'm doing today. We need to be more and more able to do this kind of web conferencing and be comfortable with that as much as possible, and offer also present an offer or follow up on a project. More and more we are likely to do this online. Master competitive selling, as you probably know, master competitive selling is something that is definitely more and more of today's interest. Have impactful documents, proposals. We need to be able to do that effectively on a PC and a tablet. Manage new types of objections, because I'll give you an example today. Let's say that, and we've had situations like that with Mercuri International. We were doing a training for a very large car company, a German one. So, and they were essentially struggling with the fact that before they were even having people showing up in their showroom for cars, people had already read everything online about a certain model, and they were coming with very, very strong objections. So this is how we actually, and this is what we actually help them deal with those objections that come even from nowhere. And this is something that can be learned. Master live and remote communication tools would be part of also what we need to have in here. Build loyalty through social media. Master the multiple sales models would also be something that we need to be able to do quite effectively. So we're about halfway through this seminar, and before I move on a little bit toward a bit more depth, what I suggest is that we stretch a little bit. One of the things that has changed is, as mentioned, many of the buyers feel the power that they have. So they are in a position to look at various suppliers, play them against each other. So some of our power is lost. And I'd like to kind of show you a little tool that we use at Mercuri International when it comes to those moments when you're meeting a tough customer or you expect it to be tough. We call that the power pose. And I'm going to show you a bit of my camera. So to illustrate, I invite you, and it's good to have a bit of a stretcher after half an hour being sitting down, most likely. Of course, this is going to be a little bit place specific. What we like to do is to gain back your power, because physiology has an impact on how we feel. So one power pose that you can take right away, if that's appropriate wherever you are, is the following. Yes, if that's okay with you. This actually gives you a feeling of power. And I don't suggest that you do this in front of a customer, but this is something that you can do at any time to actually gain a little bit more confidence and power. If this is not appropriate, perhaps you could do a popular superhero. Probably, I don't have the right gender for this one. You'll see what we call the Wonder Woman pose. Again, this is something that gives you back some of your power. If this, again, not appropriate, sometimes it might be possible to move behind your chair and actually stand on it. That, again, gives you some power. So hopefully this was a nice stretcher and perhaps a little bit of a practical tool for you guys. I like to, and we like Mercuri International to always do this, to have certain evidence-based tools and methods to actually gain the upper hand. So this is one of them. Hopefully it has helped you kind of clarify your thoughts, and so that you're ready for the next part of this seminar. So now, we mentioned that there's no longer one way of selling because there's no longer one way of buying. So I'd like to introduce to you a little bit of a model that Mercuri International has created. This is for you to identify your own sales situations. Not all of you would be experiencing the same level of resistance or the same type of objections from customers. The way this works is that essentially there are different ways of selling to customers depending on their level of autonomy and also their level of preference. Now, if you have experience, and in some industries this is quite common, even just trying to reach the customer is met with utter direct rejection. So in other words, the customer does not even want to see us. There's some industries where it's getting really harder and harder to actually meet with them. So, but there are also industries where it's still quite easy. If you ask for a meeting, you'll get it. So already this is showing the vertical difference here. So ask yourself today, are my customers welcoming me most of the time, or actually they're quite averse to seeing me? And it's not necessarily about you, it's about perhaps the reputation that salespeople in the industry have already. And this is already a mindset that the customer has for whatever reason. The other question you need to ask yourself to be able to differentiate for your own type of industry is, to what extent is your customer autonomous, or in other words, independent? To what extent can they make a decision on their own? In some industries, it has become quite simple. You just go online, click on the product you want, you get plenty of information, and you're able to be totally kind of independent in that purchase. You don't need the interference or the intervention of any salespeople whatsoever. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there are industries where still buyers cannot do away with salespeople. You're adding value. You're expected to add value because you create the solutions. You are expected to customize according to what you understand of their goals and needs and everything. So really, depending on where you stand with these, this is an entirely different approach. And the tools and the knowledge and the skills that you need in each are actually quite different. So therefore, not only do we need to be in the right place on the buyer's journey, but also we need to be able to sell using the right methods, with the right tools and the right approach. So in a nutshell, I'd like to kind of introduce a little bit more of kind of like a summary of the components to transform yourself into a future-proof sales professional. Like I mentioned, don't think that I have overpromised and under-delivered. I mentioned to you that you would have a map and a better understanding of how you can become a future-proof sales professional. That cannot be achieved in one day, even one day or even one hour, certainly not in 1 hour. In any case, what can happen though is, if you know what to do, if you understand the new buying behaviors, if you're able to be present on the online with the customer on their buying journey, if you're able to have a successful first contact, and we mentioned that this is getting more and more difficult, even just to get a first contact. If then you're able to understand the person, their background, their likes, their dislikes, what they have published online before, through different tools like Sales Navigator, for example, in LinkedIn, we're able to know much more about their interests. And this is something that we should really make more use of. In terms of expectations, understanding upfront what customers' expectations are likely to be. What are their challenges? What are their needs? This is still relevant, but we need to do a lot more research into this than before. Preparing a proposal and argumentation using the latest tools, but also being more and more, like customers expect more and more customization to their situation. They want us to be able to prepare something that really fits their needs. And this is a trend that we see more and more. They want to be able to recognize themselves in the type of proposals that we make, which is kind of a force that goes against what we are doing on our side, which is we try to standardize things as much as possible. Most companies are trying to have a standard product. So, and as salespeople, this is where we can really add value. Of course, to be able to present and defend the proposal, present it either in a 1 or 2 minute sales pitch, elevator pitch, or a longer 10 or 15 minute key C-level presentation. Or sometimes in some industries, it could be 1 hour, a few hours if you're doing bid proposals. Therefore, this is very much still relevant. Yes, overcoming resistance and closing the deal, still there, but know that resistance now comes from all kinds of areas. So we need to be super prepared to deal with those. Mastering live and remote communication tools is now part of our everyday learning. Today, we sometimes have to communicate over 10 different platforms and be proficient with each of them. So that's a challenge for all of us, perhaps more for the Generation X or the baby boomers than the millennials, but still, this is very much something that is here to stay. It's part of the third millennium sales. Now, for those of you that may ask, yeah, this was great. I have about 1 hour of understanding on what has changed and what has remained the same. What can I do to further my understanding of these things? So there are 2 upcoming courses that will be actually about the third millennium sales. So first one is September 19th to 20th at the Sheraton Pearson Airport, Toronto. And this is in English. It's an open course. Any of you can actually join. October 7th, 8th at the Marriott Trudeau Airport, Montreal. And this one is in French. Be aware of that. Don't register to the wrong course if you don't speak French. Now, registration is now open at, oh, there's been a mistake. It's ca.mercury.net. It shouldn't be ca-. I just saw the difference here. I urge you to hurry because seats are limited and flying. So we'll very quickly close on that. So make sure that you reserve your seat if this is for you. So with all that, I'd like to go to the Q&A period. So Rupalin, what are some of the questions that we have? Hello there. What are some questions that we have? I cannot hear anything. Oh, technology. This is always a bit challenging when there's some glitches like that. I cannot hear anyone at the moment. If I could have on the questions here, I can click on the questions.
Michelle, can you hear me now? I've just switched to computer audio.
Okay, I can hear you now, Ruplan.
Okay, perfect. Sorry, everybody. Thanks so much for your questions that you've already entered into the question function in your dashboard. We have someone who would like to be reminded, what does MAP mean again? And can you please review what MAP means?
Absolutely. MAP stands for maturity. Maturity is actually where the customer is in their buying journey. How close to buying are they? This is the maturity as we define it. And then autonomy, which is a little bit like what I have explained just now when I was talking about differentiated selling. Essentially, that means that to what extent they can independently make a decision on their own without you as a salesperson. The last is the preference, to what extent they have a preference towards you, they have a good attitude towards you as a salesperson, your company, your products, your services, or to what extent they could be averse to it. So this is what MAP stands for. And there's, of course, a lot of depth and there's a lot of understanding that can be had around those principles, because this is what enable us to speed up the process of the sale itself, and also enable us to follow, essentially meet the customer where they are today. And that's why it's such a great map. It's such a great tool. It gives us that roadmap to be able to be on that journey with the customer, aligned with them. Ruplan?
We have another one. How different are the 4 ways of selling that you highlighted?
Okay, perhaps for this, let me go back to that actual slide to help everyone visualize better. Actually, there's quite a world between these 4, in the sense that you can imagine that it would be great to have all the expertise and all the relational ability in the world, but if the customer doesn't want to meet with you, you're already in trouble. So, and when it comes to assertive selling or consultative selling, which are areas where we experience more resistance, the approach is actually quite different. Each of these different quadrants, these different types of selling, can easily be a 2-day workshop in Mercuri International, because they're so different. And they're if we look, let's say, at the assertive way of selling, what do you do with a prospect that doesn't want to meet with you? Or when they do indeed reluctantly meet with you, they are essentially putting a lot of pressure in terms of time. You need to be able to quickly show some insights or some value to them. As an example, because we've experienced that quite a bit in Canada, and I know some of you might actually be from that sector. Let's say healthcare. These days, a lot of doctors don't want to meet with pharmaceutical reps. And how do we still kind of open that door somehow? What are the techniques that we can use? And this can be very relevant to make sure that however long that can be, that encounter in healthcare is sometimes quite short. How can we have in those few minutes the maximum impact and really get our foot into the door? When it comes to consultative selling, the customer is more in a situation where they feel like you could bring some value. So they might be reluctant to meet with you, and yet they need you, but they don't want to spend too much time with you. They want to make sure that you add some value. So it's a different approach here. It's easier somehow, but it has to be done the right way, because most likely you're in a very competitive situation. When it comes to relation selling, so the yellow quadrant, imagine that actually you are in a situation that the customer doesn't need you, is positive towards you, but how do you keep that loyalty when most likely your product and your services are now commodities? There might be very few differences between what you sell and what your competitors are selling. So how do you keep that relationship going? So again, the skills and knowledge and abilities that you need in here are fairly different. When it comes to expertise selling, yes, the customer wants to see you, sees the value in it, but how do you add value without losing the customer in that expertise? How are you able to do the best that the customer for the customer? Because here there's always a danger that if we are, because the customer has a lot of trust in us, how do we keep that trust, and how do we make sure that we are looking at the long-term relationship with customers? So actually, we see in these 4 different quadrants that it's quite a different type of sales. It's a different type of approach entirely.
Thank you, Michelle. I think we have one more here. You mentioned the use of social media and the evolution of sales. If my business has not yet adopted social media or social selling, how can I convince them or get their buy-in?
Very good question. So you're looking more at a traditional approach, most likely, although I would not necessarily use the chart I showed earlier. Maybe I can actually move back to it, because we talk about the different digital maturity, and I think that's what this person was referring to. Now, it's not because you're selling to the building or the agricultural sector that you need to stop having any social media. That's not right. Most likely, there will be, to put it bluntly, there would be millennials that are now in agriculture or building, and maybe some of them are quite savvy, and they will want to be reached that way. So I don't think that today we can simply say we're not going to have any of those tools on social media. We need to have a presence, but know that at the end of the day, it's not a sexy website or a great social media campaign that will give you a reach to the entire market. It means that we need to go back to more traditional methods. It could be in the agricultural business, it could be calling on farmers still, if that's the type of people that you're meeting. It means to be in trade shows. It needs to create some opportunities. Recently, with a customer in the building, the construction areas, essentially one method that we have used is through the general contractor list of registered ones in the province. We were able to gather them in the same room and really influence them. So, and this was done mostly through phones and one by one. So, but the beauty of it is that by having an event where we gathered those contractors, general contractors, we were able to have a very strong impact and still use then more state-of-the-art tools of presentation and so on. So the reality, and I think this is a great question to summarize to some extent this whole presentation, that is, we need to have both. Going back to the audience that we have today, if you say half of you are Generation X, if you have made yourself more savvy in terms of social media and the digital tools, you're going to be on your way if you have the basics. So it means that basically all of us need to acquire those 52 skills, those 32 that are remain the same, 20 that are new. And it doesn't matter where you are. And of course, for a baby boomer to master social media, even for myself, sometimes I struggle at the pace it's going as a Generation X person. But there is no going back. We need to do this. And the same thing for as an advice to the 25% of millennials that we have in here. Be careful to think that social media and your digital savviness will open all doors. The reality of it is that you all still need to master the fundamentals. And again, I say the fundamentals, not the basics, because these things we need to make sure that we have. And it takes experience, it takes good training, it takes good courses to actually take us there. It takes good sales management as well. So, Rupelin, has there been...
I think we have room for one more, if you don't mind, Michelle.
I don't mind at all.
Okay, perfect. So the next one is, as someone who has been in sales on multiple continents, what is one key tip that you can give a newcomer to Canada regarding sales?
I've actually come back to Canada a few years back, and I have to say that there's the learning curve here quite a bit, because Canada is a different animal when it comes to sales. The Mercuri International has done a survey around the world when it comes to sales training, for example. What we found out was that actually Canada and the US would be considered in terms of general markets very advanced countries. But when it comes to sales training, we're almost third world here in Canada to some extent. And it's great that we have the CPSA to help make this industry much more professional. But what I'm saying by this is that in Europe, or I've been doing quite a bit in Asia. I used to do sales training in Mandarin, so I know this area quite a bit. Actually, sales and sales training and the general sales profession is actually to some extent more advanced. People are much more open to using the best knowledge and skills and training and coaching to actually improve what they do. There's a tendency sometimes in Canada to actually kind of think that we've been successful. I mean, Canada and the US have been very successful in terms of their economies for a long time. So there's a tendency to think that we know it all. What I have to say is that there is, and I've had this understanding from the CPSA, that a lot of people have had either no training for the past year. Actually, 40% of sales people have had no training whatsoever the last year. Not only this, but in many industries, the quality of that training is not up to par. It takes larger companies to be able to go in depth and research the right information, to be able to create the right type of training using the latest in psychology, the latest in terms of the tools and the technology. So what I have to say is, if you're new to this market, one of the first things you can do is get yourself some training. There is still something that is encouraging. I don't mean to say that everything is going to be different. In this presentation, you see that a lot of the skills, the basic skills. So if you were a salesperson in a different country prior to moving to Canada, you still have many of that that's transferable. So don't think that this is all entirely different. But what you're likely to have is a different culture, and a culture that, as I've experienced, can be a little bit more cynical when it comes to salespeople. So you need to prove your value early on and provide insights like what I have to say. So this would be my advice to someone moving into this country.
It's a very good advice, Michelle. Thank you so much. That's all the questions that we have for today's session.
And thank you very much, Rupelin, for handling this fantastically. And I wish to see many of you in the third Millennium Sales training coming in September and October in Toronto and Montreal.
Yes, and please feel free to email us should you have any questions about the courses or the training. But on behalf of the CPSA, of course, Michelle, thank you so much for hosting today's webinar, and of course our webinar audience for attending. As mentioned, if you'd like a recording of the webinar, the link will be available and sent to you shortly after the webinar. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email me at salessuccess@cpsa.com. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
And have a great day, Michelle.
You too.
Okay, bye.
Bye.